The town of Kindlebluff, Wyoming, held its debt auction on the last Friday of every month, and nobody called it a debt auction. They called it a labor settlement, which was the kind of name that made a shameful thing sound like a legal one. When a family could not pay what it owed to the county, back taxes, unpaid boarding fees, hospital debts accumulated through no particular fault, but through the particular cruelty of circumstances, the county had authority to offer the labor of a family member as compensation. A term of service, the paperwork said, a contractual arrangement entered into voluntarily, which was only true if you considered signing under threat of losing your home to be a choice. It was 1883 and October, and the Wyoming wind was doing what the Wyoming wind does in October, which is remind everyone that winter is not coming so much as it has already decided to arrive on its own schedule. Nolan Briggs stood at the edge of the crowd with his coat buttoned wrong and no particular reason for being there. He was 52 years old, a widower who ran a modest freight operation out of a rented yard on the north side of Kindlebluff, with 2 wagons and a mule named Pocket and a reputation for being reliable if not particularly warm. He had been on his way to the feed merchant when the crowd outside the county hall had slowed his path. He had stopped because stopping was easier than pushing through. He was about to keep walking when he saw the woman. She was standing at the end of the line of debtors, which told something. The others had been settled quickly. A young man taken by a mining operation north of town. A middle-aged husband, a farmer, taken by the man he owed. The crowd had moved through these arrangements with the brisk efficiency of people who have come for a specific thing and obtained it. The woman at the end of the line had not been obtained. She was perhaps 28 or 29, though the set of her jaw made her look older. Medium height with dark reddish hair pulled back in a knot that had not been arranged that morning with any vanity, just practicality. Her dress was clean but had been mended at both elbows. Her hands, folded in front of her, were the hands of someone who had done physical work for years. She was looking at the crowd with gray eyes that were not frightened and not pleading. They were simply watching, measuring, the way a person watches a situation when they have already accepted the situation but have not yet determined how to move through it. Nolan had watched 3 men approach her and withdraw, not because she had said anything to them, she hadn't. They had looked her over in the way men look over a horse they are considering, and then their eyes had gone to the 2 small figures standing beside her, and that had ended the consideration. 2 children, a boy of perhaps 7, with her same reddish hair and a serious face, and a girl of 4 or 5 holding the woman's skirt with both hands and looking at the crowd with very large eyes that were not the eyes of a child accustomed to feeling safe. The county man, a stout fellow named Orvis with ink on his fingers and the air of someone who has lost all feeling for what he is doing through sheer repetition, came to the end of the line and looked at the woman and looked at his ledger and looked at the crowd, which had thinned considerably. "Mrs. Vane?" he said, not hopefully, the way a man reads the last name off a list he is trying to close. "Still here," the woman said. Her voice was even. Not defiant, just accurate. Orvis looked at the crowd. "Any takers for the Vane arrangement?" He said it the way you say a thing you already know the answer to. Nolan did not intend to speak. He was watching the boy, who had taken his mother's hand at some point without looking at her, the way children take a hand when they know something is wrong, but do not want to admit they are afraid. The girl had pressed herself against the woman's leg. The woman had not looked down at either of them. She was still looking at the crowd. Then her eyes found Nolan's. She did not look away, neither did he. "What are the terms?" Nolan said. Orvis looked up from his ledger with some surprise. 6 months of labor service to clear the tax debt. $2.40 is the assessed amount. And the children? They stay with the mother. Arrangement includes board for the family on the employer's property. Orvis consulted his ledger. Mother's name is Margaret Vane. Age 29. Husband deceased. Children are Oliver, age 7, and Pearl, age 4. Nolan looked at Margaret Vane. She was still watching him with those gray measuring eyes. She was not trying to appear agreeable or unthreatening. She was simply looking at him the way you look at a person you are trying to determine the nature of. He respected that. "What work can she do?" Nolan said. "Ask her," Orvis said with the tone of a man who has learned that this is generally the more efficient approach. Nolan looked at Margaret. "What work can you do?" "Anything you have," she said. "Accounts if you keep them. Loading and unloading. I've driven a team. I can cook and I can stretch a food budget to distances that would surprise you." She paused. "I am not slow and I am not careless, and I don't need instruction more than once." There was nothing aggressive in this. It was inventory, an honest accounting of what she was offering. Nolan looked at the boy, Oliver, who was looking back at him with an expression that was trying very hard to be neutral. The girl, Pearl, had turned her face against her mother's leg. Nolan reached into his coat. He paid the $2.40. He was not entirely certain in the moment of paying it what he was doing. He had a freight yard. He had accounts that were kept in a system that made sense to no one but himself. He had a house that was too large for one person and too quiet by a measure he had stopped quantifying. He had not intended to acquire any of this. He had intended to buy feed for Pocket. Margaret Vane stood beside him while Orvis completed the paperwork. When it was done, she looked at Nolan with those gray eyes and said, "You didn't ask why we're in debt." "No," he said. "Aren't you curious?" "If you want to tell me, you'll tell me," he said. "If you don't, it won't change what I just signed." She looked at him for a moment. Something in her face shifted, not softened exactly, but recalibrated. "My husband died in the spring," she said. "He left debts I didn't know about. I've been working them down for 6 months. $240 was what was left." "All right," Nolan said. "That's all you're going to say? What would you like me to say?" She almost said something. Then she didn't. "Where do we go?" she said instead. "I'll show you," he said. The freight yard on the north side of town was not grand. 2 wagons in various states of repair. A barn that needed work on its east wall but was sound otherwise. The mule Pocket who regarded all new arrivals with calm suspicion and then forgot about them. A house behind the yard that had 4 rooms and a kitchen, and a stove that drew well and a front porch with a bench on it that had been Nolan's wife's idea, and that he had not been able to bring himself to remove even though no one used it now. Margaret Vane walked through the house with her children behind her and said nothing. She looked at the stove. She opened 2 cabinets. She looked at the accounts ledger on the table, which Nolan had left open because he'd been working on it that morning. She looked at it the way you look at something you recognize. "This is your freight accounts," she said. "Yes, you have 3 entries in the wrong column." Nolan looked at her. "May I?" she said, gesturing at the ledger. He nodded. She sat down and found the errors in approximately 4 minutes. She did not say anything about finding them. She corrected them and moved on, as if the demonstration was sufficient and further comment would be redundant. It was, Nolan thought, the most efficient 4 minutes he had spent in recent memory. He showed the family the back bedroom, which had a window that faced east and caught the morning light. It was the better bedroom of the 2 smaller ones, which he had not thought about before saying it was theirs. Margaret Vane put Pearl down on the bed, and the girl curled immediately and was asleep in the particular way of small children who have been frightened for a long time and finally feel something that is not threat. Margaret watched her for a moment. Then she turned to Nolan. "Oliver and I will start in the morning," she said. "What time do your drivers come?" 6, he said. "We'll be up at 5, she said. She was. The freight work in October was the heavy work, the pre-winter rush of goods that everyone in the territory needed to have in place before the passes became unreliable. Nolan ran 2 routes, one north to the mines and one east toward the homestead territories, and both required more organization than he had been giving them. Margaret took the accounts within the first week and did not so much reorganize them as rescue them. She found 2 outstanding invoices that had not been collected. She found a regular expense he had been paying twice because his system had not distinguished between 2 vendors with similar names. She told him about these things matter-of-factly, without triumph, the way you tell someone about a problem that has been sitting in front of them so long it became invisible. Oliver, meanwhile, had found his purpose in the barn. He was too young for heavy work, but he was not too young for the patient, repetitive labor of caring for an animal. Pocket the mule, who tolerated adults with guarded neutrality, took an immediate and inexplicable liking to the boy. Within 3 days, Oliver was the one who fed Pocket in the morning, and Pocket would come to the barn door when he heard Oliver's step and stand there with the air of an animal who has decided a specific person is his. Nolan watched this from the yard and said nothing about it. But he noticed. The trouble came in November from a man named Crockett, which was not his given name, but the name everyone in Kindlebluff used for him because he dressed the way he believed Davy Crockett had dressed and because correcting people on his actual name had stopped working around 1879. Crockett ran a competing freight operation that was larger than Nolan's and managed through meds that were legal in the sense of never having been proven otherwise. He had decided, sometime in the past several years, that Nolan's modest operation was an inconvenience. He came to the yard one Tuesday morning while Nolan was on his north route. He found Margaret in the yard supervising the loading of a wagon and told her, with the particular cheerfulness of a man who believes his size is an argument, that he was aware of her arrangement and that it would be in her interest to share certain information about Nolan's routes and scheduling with him. Margaret set down the clipboard she was holding. "No," she said. Crockett looked at her. He was not accustomed to being told no by women in freight yards. "I don't think you understand what I'm saying," he said. "I understood it the first time," she said. "The answer is no." He left. He did not leave quietly. The hand who had been loading the wagon told Nolan about it that evening when he returned. The hand was 17, with a strong sense of justice and the directness of someone who has not yet learned to soften things for the sake of social comfort. Nolan went to find Margaret. She was in the kitchen, doing the accounts, with Pearl asleep in the chair beside her, and Oliver reading something at the other end of the table. She looked up when he came in. "I heard about Crockett," he said. "It's handled," she said. "He'll come back," he said. "I know," she said. "I've dealt with men like him before." "Your husband?" he said, and then stopped, because it was not his business. She looked at him steadily. "My husband was a good man," she said. "Not careful, but good. The debts weren't dishonest. He just believed things would work out, and sometimes they don't." She paused. "The man who held our primary debt was like Crockett. He is why I understand Crockett." "What happened with him?" "I paid him what was owed, and he has no hold on me," she said. "That's what happens when you don't give them anything else to work with." Oliver, at the other end of the table, had not looked up from his book. But Nolan saw the slight change in the boy's shoulders, the particular stillness of a child who is listening to something that matters to him, even though he is pretending not to hear it. Nolan went the next day to the county sheriff, who was an old acquaintance, and had a conversation with torture Crockett that was not threatening and was not a complaint in the formal sense, but that the sheriff understood completely, and which resulted in Crockett finding his next 2 months considerably more complicated than he had expected them to be. Margaret never knew about this, or if she did, she gave no sign of it. December arrived, and with it the slowdown that winter always brought to freight work. Nolan paid down the route crews to a single driver and spent more time in the yard, doing the repair work that the season demanded. Margaret continued the accounts and began, without being asked, reorganizing the invoicing system into something that would survive being used by someone other than her. He noticed this. He was sitting at the kitchen table one evening, November fading into December, watching her work on the system. Pearl had climbed into his lap somewhere in the past hour, which she had started doing around the 3rd week, without ceremony, simply placing herself there as if this were something they had agreed to. He had not objected. Pearl weighed almost nothing and was warm and smelled like the soap Margaret used, and fell asleep quickly. Oliver was working on a letter. Nolan had discovered that Oliver could write better than most adults in Kindlebluff, which his mother said was because his father had read to him every evening from the time he was 2 years old, and had believed that reading and writing were the only possessions no one could take away. "Margaret," Nolan said. She looked up. "I need to tell you something." She set down her pen. She gave things her full attention when they required it. "Your 6 months will be up in March," he said. "You'll have fulfilled the arrangement." "Yes," she said. "I've been thinking," he said, "about what comes after that." He looked at the fire. "I have a freight operation that is running better than it has in 4 years because you fixed things that I had let go wrong. I have a mule that has decided your son is his person, which means if Oliver leaves, I lose both of them." He paused, and I have been. He stopped because this was harder to say. "I have been coming into this kitchen at the end of the day, and it has not felt the way it has felt for the past 3 years, which is empty." Margaret was watching him with her gray eyes. "I am not saying this as an employer," he said. "I'm saying it plainly because I think you prefer plain. I would like to offer you a permanent position, paid fairly, which is different from the current arrangement." He looked at her. "But that's the lesser part of what I'm saying." "What's the greater part?" she said. He thought about how to say it. "I have been alone since my wife died," he said. 7 years. I am not good at it. I am functional at it, which is different." He looked at Pearl, asleep in his lap, "And I think you have been doing something similar, functional, since the spring." The kitchen was quiet. Outside, the Wyoming wind moved through the yard. "I'm not proposing anything that isn't proper," he said quickly. "I am not. You are in an arrangement where I have a degree of authority over your situation, and I'm aware of that, and I'm not." "Nolan," she said. He stopped. "I know what you're saying," she said. "I'm not a woman who misunderstands things." She was quiet for a moment. "I have been trying to determine whether you are a man I can trust." "And," he said. "You didn't ask why I was in debt," she said. "You paid without asking me to thank you. You spoke to the sheriff about Crockett without telling me and thought I wouldn't find out." She paused. "I found out." Nolan was quiet. "You fixed something without making me feel like I needed to be grateful for the fixing," she said. "That's not a small thing." He looked at her. "Ask me again in the spring," she said. "When the arrangement is done and I'm not standing in your yard on the county's terms, ask me when I'm standing there on my own." "All right," he said. "But I'll tell you now," she said, and there was something in her voice that had not been there before, something that was not warmth exactly but was adjacent to it, "that I think the answer will be yes." The winter work was quieter work. Nolan repaired the east wall of the barn. Margaret finished the invoicing system and began, because she had run out of things to reorganize, teaching Oliver the basics of freight accounting on the theory that he might want the knowledge someday. Oliver learned with the focused absorption of a child who has not yet discovered that learning is supposed to be difficult. Pearl grew more certain of herself by the week. She had decided by January that Pocket the mule was also hers, and Pocket had accepted this with the philosophical generosity of an animal who sees no contradiction in belonging to two people. She could be found most mornings sitting on the fence rail of the barn while Oliver did the feeding, providing what appeared to be supervisory commentary. Nolan watched these things and said very little about them, because very little needed to be said. He had started without planning to, knowing the sounds of the household. Pearl's particular morning sound, which was somewhere between talking and singing, and was directed at no one in particular. Oliver's step, which was deliberate and always exactly as loud as it needed to be. Margaret's movement through the kitchen, which was the movement of someone who has always been efficient, and has simply never had a space organized to her efficiency before, and who is now working at full capacity for the first time in some years. He had not known he was listening for these things until the morning in January, when Margaret took the children into town for supplies, and the house was quiet, and he understood, in the particular clarity that absence creates, that the house had not felt this specific kind of empty in 7 years. In March, Orvis from the county came with the paperwork that officially closed the labor settlement arrangement for Margaret Vane. Nolan signed his portion. Margaret signed hers. Orvis left. Margaret stood in the yard in her coat, with the signed copy of the paperwork in her hands. The yard was mud and thaw, the particular transition of Wyoming in March that is not yet spring but has stopped being winter. Oliver was in the barn with Pocket. Pearl had followed Orvis partway down the road to watch him go and was now standing at the gate, observing the street with the proprietary interest of a 5-year-old who has decided that a place belongs to her. Nolan came out of the freight office. "Arrangement's done," he said. "It is," she said. "You're standing in my yard on your own terms now." She looked at him, the gray eyes that had been measuring him since that October morning outside the county hall, measuring, and now something in them had arrived at a conclusion. "I am," she said. "Then I'm asking," he said. The wind came through the yard, the first wind of March that carries something in it that is not cold, something that is the memory of warmth rather than warmth itself. But that reminds you warmth is coming. Pearl, at the gate, had turned around and was watching them with the interest of a child who doesn't know what is happening but can tell that it is something. Margaret Vane looked at Nolan Briggs for a long moment. "Yes," she said. The wedding was in May, a small thing at the county registrar's office, with the web, with Clara Morse from the boarding house as witness, because she had been following the situation with the satisfaction of a woman watching something go right and had strongly indicated that she intended to be present for the conclusion. Oliver stood next to Nolan. Pearl stood next to her mother and held very carefully the small flowers someone had cut from the yard. Margaret kept the freight accounts because she was better at them and both of them knew it, and Nolan had the sense to say so plainly. Oliver learned the mule routes by the time he was 9 and was driving the shorter one with supervision by 11. Pearl grew up to have her mother's gray eyes and her father's patience, and a particular talent for negotiating rates with suppliers that became the subject of local appreciation when she was 15, and Nolan quietly stepped back from that part of the business and let her manage it. There was a competitor in those years, a new operation that came in with better equipment and more capital, and it was Pearl who noticed their rate structure, and Margaret who found the niche they had missed, and Oliver who drove the relationship with the mining contracts north of town. Nolan provided what he had always provided, which was the reliability and the good name, and the willingness to hire people based on what they could do rather than what they looked like doing it. He was not given to speeches or declarations. He had said what needed saying in the kitchen on that November evening, and he did not add to it. But he was there every morning when the yard came to life, and every evening when it quieted, and in between he was the kind of person whose steadiness you stop noticing because it has become the ground you stand on, and that is a kind of presence that is harder to provide than most people realize. On the evening of Pearl's 16th birthday, a summer evening, the yard lit with lanterns, and the table set outside with more food than the occasion required, she found Nolan at the fence watching the mule, who had reached an age that was extremely old for a mule, but who appeared to have decided that age was not a sufficient reason to stop working. "Pocket's getting slow," she said. "He is," Nolan said. "Oliver cried about it last week. He thinks I didn't see." "I know," Nolan said. Pearl leaned on the fence beside him. She was tall like her father had been, which she had decided by the time she was 12 was simply a fact and not a problem. "Mr. Briggs," she said. She had called him this until she was 10, and then one day had simply not, and now she only used it when she was being deliberate. "Pearl," he said. "Are you glad," she said, "that you stopped that morning?" He looked at her. 16 years old, with her mother's gray eyes and her own particular quality, which was a generosity of attention that made people feel, when she was speaking to them, that they were the only thing in the world that mattered at the moment. "Every day," he said, "every single one." She nodded, the nod of someone who already knew the answer and asked for the pleasure of hearing it said aloud. Then she went back to the table, where Oliver was arguing with Margaret about something that made Margaret almost smile, actually smile, the real smile that changed her face entirely, and Nolan stood at the fence in the summer evening and thought about $2.40. The last he had, essentially, on a morning in October, when he had been on his way to buy feed and had stopped because the crowd was in his way, and had looked up and seen a woman with gray eyes who was already measuring him before he had decided anything. Not a worker, not a settlement, a family. The one he had not known he was missing until he was standing in the mud outside the county hall, and she looked at him without flinching, without asking, without performing hope, and waited to see what kind of man he was. He had spent the rest of his life trying to be worth that particular look. He thought, on the whole, that he had managed it.